Welcome to the Animal Training Academy podcast show. I'm your host, Ryan Carledge, and I'm passionate about helping you master your animal training skills using the most positive and least intrusive approaches. Here at ATA, we understand that navigating the vast challenges you encounter in training requires a comprehensive base of knowledge and experience. It's common to face obstacles and rough patches on your journey that can leave you feeling overwhelmed and stressed. Therefore, since 2015, we've been on a mission to empower animal training geeks worldwide. We've aided thousands in developing their skills, expanding their knowledge, boosting their confidence, and maximizing their positive impact on all the animal and human learners they work with. We are excited to do the same for you. Simply visit www.atamember.com, join our vibrant community, and geek out with us. And of course, in the meantime, enjoy this free podcast episode as we explore new ways to help you supercharge your training skills, grow your knowledge, and build your confidence, so that you can craft a life that positively impacts every learner you encounter. We will start today's episode where we're going to be talking to one Erin Jones. Erin is an independent scholar, content editor for the IAABC Foundation Journal, international speaker and educator and author. She holds a PhD in Human Animal Studies, a MS in Anthrozoology, a BS with honours in Psychology and Anthropology, and researches and writes about the ethical dimensions of the dog-human relationship. Erin is also a certified dog behaviour consultant and accredited dog trainer with the IAABC, a certified professional dog trainer with the CCPDT, and accredited animal behaviour consultant with CANS. Her new book, Constructing Canine Consent, is available in bookstores worldwide, and her other publications are available to access on her website, meritproject.com. So without further ado, it's my very great pleasure to welcome Erin to the show today, who is patiently waiting by. Erin, thank you so much for taking the time to come and hang out with us here at Animal Training Academy.
Oh, thank you for inviting me. I'm really excited to be here.
Yeah, I can't wait to dive in and learn about your journey, Erin. So I was hoping that you could take the listeners back and share where you got started, learning about animal training, about positive reinforcement, just getting into behavior in general, and share some stories with us from your animal training and behavior journey.
Absolutely. I actually started off in the horse world. So I was involved in the sport of show jumping, and I was very involved in that for a long time, all through my undergraduate journey as well. And then I had some life changes. I moved around a little bit, and although I was still involved with horses, I kind of wanted a bit of a change. So I we moved around a little bit, and I ended up getting a job working at an aquarium, which was very out of my comfort zone a little bit, but really interesting to me. Although I do also think this is a little bit where my journey to animal liberation, animal rights, and thinking about the ethical dimensions of the human and non-human animal relationships started. I wasn't there very long. I had some probably, I guess, some uh, there were moral things that I wasn't sure about while I was working there. So I started thinking and researching it a little bit more deeply and ended up leaving. But while I was there, I really had a great time learning about the mechanics of marker training and getting my skills really honed. I had a really great time working with some wonderful people and meeting some wonderful non-human animals as well. I got to work with the California sea lions and the African black-footed penguins, which was really exciting for me. Um, but I ended up moving on from there and getting involved with, and I've always had dogs in my life, and they've always been very important to me. And I was always really interested in training, but I didn't really have a deep understanding about their behavior. So I started on that journey. I ended up getting a job at um, a veterinary clinic. And I, as well as working in the clinic, I also started working with, so one of the co-owners of the clinic was a dog trainer. And so she had her, that part of the clinic was, teaching puppy classes and doing one-on-one um, training sessions with people as well. And so I got very involved with that with her and started working alongside her. We developed some classes together. She supported me while I got my certification through the Certification Council for Professional Dog Trainers. And then came to me one day and said, "Hey, Erin, I'm going on maternity leave, so I'd love if you took over the behavior part of the clinic," which was both very intimidating, but also very exciting and empowering. And so I did, and I did that for quite a while. Loved doing it. It was such a great environment and such a great learning opportunity for me, especially being in that clinic environment, because I had a lot of referrals from the in-house vet for more complex behavior cases, which was something that I was very interested in. And so that's how I sort of got more involved with that side of the more complex behavior stuff. And so from there, I decided I wanted to go on. And while I was doing this, I also got a post grad diploma in animal welfare, which was something sort of I thought about doing after leaving the aquarium. So that was kind of happening in the background as well. And um, and so I decided I wanted to go to grad school and do my master's. I'd been out of school for quite some time at this point, and so it was a bit intimidating, but obviously I was very involved in the applied animal behavior world and thought this is, obviously I'm going to want to do something in applied animal behavior, possibly animal welfare, because those were the things that I was most familiar with. So I started doing some Googling of different master's programs that were out there, different opportunities. And I came across the Masters of Anthrozoology program at Canisius University in Buffalo, New York. And I was like, what the heck is anthrozoology? I had never heard of it before. So I started reading about it. And if you haven't heard of what that is or you're unsure about what that is, it's often the term human animal studies or even animal studies are used synonymously with anthrozoology. So just the study of human and non-human animal interactions, which is really a very huge and very interdisciplinary field because we have people who are doing social sciences, we have people who are doing more quantitative research, even and all sorts of different relationships as well, right? So not maybe wildlife and human interactions or dog human interactions, that kind of thing. So I started reading the course descriptions and I was like, wow, this program is like exactly everything that I need. When I think about dog training, we're thinking about that dog human relationship. That's exactly what this is all about for me. So I decided to apply and I got in. And the program was a low residency program, meaning we did a 5-day intensive on campus component at the beginning of each semester, so twice a year. And it was a 2-year program. And I met some of the most wonderful people there. It was just, I felt like I was home, like I had found my people. And I think everyone in the program kind of felt similar, but we were also all doing very or interested in all very different kind of research topics as well, which made it really even more interesting to me. So some people were really into the wildlife or zoos or um, animal assisted intervention or those kinds of aspects of the human animal relationship. I met several dog trainers because I think it's very appealing for that community. And I still to this day have really good connections with the people that I went to school with there, including working on projects together still. We just published a book. Well, it's not out yet, it's forthcoming. So I co-edited a book on human and non-human animal coexistence. And so lots of different projects going on with those people that I met there who were very much like-minded, which was just a really amazing opportunity and amazing place to be, and spurred me on to want to do my PhD. And at the time, I had sort of moved away from the vet clinic and had started Merit Dog Project, which is my business now. And I did that full time while doing my master's full time, which was honestly a lot, but it was also very important to me and invigorating. And I loved it so much. I didn't teach classes at that point. I just did one-on-one behavior cases. I was really interested at the time in separation anxiety related behaviors. So that was a big focus of mine, but took on all clients, anybody who was in need. And yeah, and so from there, I was also working at Dalhousie University at the time. So there was a lot going on in my life. This is very normal for me. Like, I don't know why I take on so many projects all at once, but I kind of thrive on it, I think. So I was working there TAing or teaching as a teaching assistant in animal physiology lab, a third year course, as well as advanced animal behavior with Dr. Catherine Reeve, who was teaching the course while Dr. Simon Gabois was on sabbatical. And I got to know Simone. So some of you have probably heard his name before. He's done a lot of speaking engagements recently. He's very, very wonderful and knowledgeable person about dogs. And I had been in talking with him about doing a PhD with him as my supervisor, and was very keen to do that. And that was sort of my plan, to be honest. However, I was planning to do my PhD in what is called an interdisciplinary PhD. So it's not in one specific department, it's in sort of multiple schools, I guess. And so it's quite a process to apply to this program, which I was totally prepared to do. However, I kind of was behind the eight ball a little bit on applying for funding for my PhD, which I needed to have before the application could be approved. And at the same time, I came across this program here in New Zealand at the University of Canterbury. And I was very keen on it for a few reasons. One, it was in New Zealand. That seemed very appealing to me. And the second was that it was in human animal studies, which is essentially what I wanted to be doing. So I kind of wanted that attached to the title of my PhD. And also, I mean, the supervisory team here was amazing, and they offered me a full scholarship and stipend, and I just felt like I would be stupid to say no. So I decided that's what we were going to do. So I told my husband we are packing up and we're going to New Zealand, which he was fortunately excited about too. We did have an older dog at the time when I was accepted initially. So she was 18 and she was sort of at the later stages of cognitive decline. And I knew she didn't have long. So I ended up kind of strategically applying and then deferring until she was ready to part ways with us. So we were kind of in limbo for a few months there. And then ultimately she passed and we were ready to come. So we applied for our visas and we made the move across the globe, literally probably one of the farthest places we could possibly move to, and made our home here in New Zealand. And so once here, I established actually at first I was like, oh, I'm just going to concentrate on my PhD. I'm not going to take any clients. I'm going to take a little break from that, which lasted all of about 2 months because I always get pulled into working with clients and I really enjoy it. And so I started my PhD at the university, and I was very keen on doing something related to the dog human relationship, but I wasn't really sure what I wanted to do specifically. And so I kind of, I guess, was drawn to the idea of looking at how our expectations about dogs and dog behavior influence their lives and influences their behavior. And the role of human exceptionalism, or the human exceptionalism paradigm, which says, that humans tend to think that we are far superior or superior to nature or other animals. And I wanted to think about how this paradigm, even implicitly, influences those expectations that we have for our dogs. And the topic of consent kind of came up as I was, I guess, thinking about my proposal, and so I decided to add that question into my research as well. What is consent, and can we apply the topic of, or the idea or the definition of consent to other animals? Are they autonomous? Are they able to make autonomous decisions? Those kinds of ethical questions that are really difficult. But it's interesting because at first, the topic of consent is a bit of a buzzword, I guess, in the dog training world, or it was at that point, but more in an applied way. We were talking about things like, consent tests. Can we see if our dogs want to interact with us when we're petting them? Those kinds of questions, which are very, to me, interesting and important, but a bit on the surface, right? What is all of that, all of the layers beneath that? That's what I was interested in, sort of peeling back and finding out and digging deeper. And around, I guess, 4 or 5 months into starting my PhD, we decided it was time for another dog. And so we adopted Juno into our lives. She was 10 weeks old at the time. She didn't probably have, well, she definitely didn't have the best first 10 weeks of her life. She was in a very rural part of New Zealand, living in an outdoor pen, very little contact with people or really any different stimulus in the environment, and being fed pig carcasses, and so it was rough. And I did meet her mom. She was also a very nervous dog. I feel like there's probably some genetic component to all of this, but Juno was a very, very fearful puppy, probably one of the most fearful puppies that I've ever worked with. And as I was developing these ideas about consent, it really hit me that this is super important for her in order to make her feel safe. And so right from the start, this was something that I worked on with her significantly. And thinking about things like, how can I provide her with agency and choice, and also opportunity, and also think about ways of allowing her to communicate and know that her communication has been heard and respected. That was really important to me, and I think it made a massive difference in her life. These are all things I did think about before this, but I really started to think about them in a more nuanced way, I guess, and how I was going to work that into my behavior plan with her. And so, yeah, I think that's where that idea of consent sort of started. The seed was planted and it grew from there. And it just sort of snowballed, really. And yeah, so that was my, my life in a nutshell.
Well, thanks for sharing all of that so far. And we're going to talk more about your book, Constructing Canine Consent, in the follow-up episode to this one. and you used the word human exceptionalism there, which is potentially the second time I've heard that phrase. The first
Mhm.
time was this morning when I read prologue in your book. But you also used another word, another phrase, I should say, sorry, talking about your time working at the aquarium,
Mhm.
which I'm assuming was in Canada.
Yes, sorry, yes. Yeah.
And you used the word animal liberation.
Yes.
What do you mean by that?
So animal liberation is about, well, for me, it's about um, thinking about animals, centering animals more wholly in our worldview. So, when I talked about human exceptionalism, the idea is that we are sort of at the top of this pyramid of species on this planet, and that we have ultimate control over all of it. We are better than all of these other animals, and therefore we can use them in a way that benefits us, whether it's eating them or wearing them or using them for their labor or any of those things. We can breed them, we can manipulate their lives because it's okay to do because we are superior to them. They don't have the same abilities that we have. But I think in an animal liberationist viewpoint, we're thinking about how animals are simply or other animals are simply different than humans. We're all animals, for one, but we all have different abilities and capabilities. And just because ours are different doesn't mean that they're necessarily better than. And so it's about thinking about the things that matter to those animals and how we can create a world that respects that and that allows them to live their lives in a way that is important to them. So it definitely is akin to animal rights, I guess, in a lot of ways. And animal rights has a lot of different theories and viewpoints. So I always think of it as a bit of a spectrum. So we've got the people who think, especially when it comes to dogs, I like to think about the one sort of extreme is we have theories about um, we shouldn't have pets at all. We should, stop breeding dogs. Or we should let them all free, or whatever, this abolitionist approach would be. And then on the other end, we have sort of these welfare systems. How can we still use these animals, but just make their lives better? Um, while we're still using them. And so there's everything in between for me, and for me I fall in different spots on that spectrum when it comes to different topics, I think. So I don't think I'm at either extreme ever, but I'm always somewhere in that spectrum of thinking. But I'm always changing too, because I don't think that when we're thinking about animal ethics that there's necessarily um, a, there's not one right system. I think there's a lot of questions that don't have answers. And we certainly don't know everything about the ability of other animals, even if we try really, really hard to understand their abilities and capabilities. We can never truly understand their experiences. So if you've ever read Thomas Nagel, he wrote in, I think it was 74, 75, he wrote an article called What It's Like to Be a Bat, or I think that's what it's called. And he talks about um, ultimately he's talking about what is called their umwelt, or this term was actually described by a person named Uxkull. I'm not sure if I'm saying that correctly, probably butchering that name completely. But it's about their unique sensory abilities and experiences of the world. So what I experience is going to be very different from what my dog Juno experiences when she's navigating her environment. I mean, we know that dogs, their primary sense of is their sense of smell, where us primates, our primary sense, if we're visually not visually impaired, is our vision. And so if we're designing tests to test the cognitive abilities of other animals, we're going to be inherently biased by our own set of limitations. So in, we can never fully understand their experience, even if we can understand a lot about them. And I think this is a really important aspect because it tells us that there's probably things that they can do and experience that we're just never going to fully grasp. And I think that's even more special than the things that we know about. And so there's nothing to say that we are superior to them in any way. We just live differently or experience the world differently to them. And so their experiences matter. And I think that's really important. And then on the other spectrum of that is that we know that there are lots of similarities as well. And I think that's important for people to help empathize with other animals so that they can say, okay, well, they're going to experience pain in a similar way that we experience pain, or trauma in a similar way that we experience trauma. And that helps us to situate ourselves in this picture and how we're relating to those animals, and help us to have a better understanding of, especially when it comes to something like consent, or providing them with relevant choices, because we have an understanding of where they're coming from, and we can relate to that experience in a way. So it's kind of both, right? We've got the one end where we don't really know what they're experiencing fully, but we know that they do experience lots of things in similar ways that we do as well. And I think that both of those things are really important to think about when we're talking about our relations with other animals. I don't know if that answers your question, but so I think animal liberation is about considering those topics and how we can, I guess, appreciate other animals in their own right.
I was thinking as you're talking, we probably don't understand the unwelt of each other, let alone another species. Even though our is it an accurate statement? Like, even though our perceptions as a species uh, are obviously with variation between individuals, very similar if not the same. The perception and the way we experience things is differently. So if you think about like how hard it is to understand each other, which it is, I don't think I'm alone in that, Erin.
Yeah, no,
Like when you actually think about from another species, that reminded me of the book. I haven't read that article. Maybe we can link to that. Are we smart enough to know how smart animals are? Which,
yeah.
just that title kind of brings up the questions that you're bringing up.
Yeah, absolutely. And Franz de Waal, I mean, he was an amazing inspiration in my own work, and an amazing human being and researcher talking about these exact things, right? How much do we know, and can we actually know? And you're absolutely right. I mean, I don't know that I experience even the feelings of pain the same way someone else might, but I can't really truly understand their feeling, like how they're feeling internally either, or someone else might be feeling about a situation. And so, yeah, imagine then trying to make that assumption across species boundaries. It's really, really difficult, especially when they experience their world in such different way than we do. And maybe even in ways that we don't. They might not just experience them differently, but they have experiences that we can't even visualize or imagine because we don't have those experiences.
And so you brought this up in regards to the animal liberalism. Did I say that correct? Term in terms of your work at the aquariums, but obviously since then you've added a lot of the academia part of your journey in terms of your education and attending different courses in universities and getting degrees and PhDs and masters. But were you thinking along these lines in the aquarium? Is that why you brought it up then? Has this like thought, regardless of your academic pursuits and achievements, always been something that's been in your mind? Like when you're at the aquarium, was that just coming to the front of your thoughts as you're watching it? Because you said you weren't there for very long.
Right. I wasn't there for very long. But yes, I think that's where to me, that's where it started, I think. I mean, I was always very interested in animal rights. I've been a vegan most of my life. I've had very deeply rooted ideals about our relationships with other animals. But I think I don't know that I had a deep understanding about animal rights at that point. And I think that's where it piqued my interest because I I just started having conflicting, like I loved being there, but I also had conflicting feelings about being there and started to read and hear more about the idea of animal liberation and whether these animals should even be captive and whether it's right or wrong or the morals around having those animals say perform in a performance for people, their entertainment value, and then is this simply for human entertainment, or is there some benefit to the animals in this situation? And so I think I started thinking about these questions more deeply. You know, when I first got the job there, I was just so thrilled that that I was going to be working with these amazing animals because I loved animals. And then, yes, as I was there, I started, I had questions about, say, I mean, they absolutely met the standards of the Zoos and Aquarium Association that were set forth for their welfare. But I then questioned whether these standards were good enough. And so I think that's where that whole journey started. And it was it wasn't something that happened overnight for me. So it was something that really developed over the last, you know, 10 years maybe. And I mean, more deeply, I guess. Like I always had that, like animal welfare matters perspective. But I think thinking about these more difficult questions that may, again, not have answers really started for me at that point. And then I started learning more about it and reading more about it. And I read a book by Hal Herzog called, oh, I gotta, well, I can't. It is called What Some We Love, Some We Hate, Some We Eat, I think. Hope I got that right. And it was a life-changing book for me. I don't know, like it made me think about all of these questions like that were there in my head, but I hadn't really, I guess, dug into because they're hard questions and they're difficult questions to ask ourselves, especially when we love animals, because then we have to question if what we're doing is ethical and if what we're doing is the right thing. And maybe what we've been doing our whole lives isn't right, or maybe there's a better way to be doing things, and we have to admit that to ourselves. And then if we admit that to ourselves about dogs and cats, what about other animals that are like farmed animals or animals that are living in captive settings? So yeah, I think coming back to your original question, that was the sort of the jumping off point for me, and then I just started swimming from there. And then it took me all the way to where I am now. And I definitely think about those questions in terms of other animals as well, but I think my background in dog behavior is what drove me to ask these questions about dogs specifically. And I do think that in the future it would be great to ask these questions about consent and other species as well. I actually had a lovely friend who attended Canisius with me, who just finished her doctorate in education and did her dissertation on consent in the farmed animal sanctuary settings. And it was just amazing. She did such a wonderful job. And I loved seeing that progression of this discussion about the topic of consent, the topic of assent and dissent, the topic of agency, and the topic of autonomy being spoken about in terms in applying it to other animals.
Maybe we can get your friend on the show. I'm curious if did your upbringing foster this kind of creativity? Is that something that's come from your environment and your parents, or was that an innate thing that is unique to yourself? A bit of both.
I think it's a bit of both. I definitely come from a creative family. My sister is incredibly creative. She's a writer and amazing. Um, but the animal rights perspectives and the idea of animal welfare and my interest in other animals, um, well, I think my mother was definitely an animal lover, but not in the same capacity. I was the only one in my family who did not eat meat. And that started at the age of 9 for me. So I I think my main influence at the time, to be perfectly honest with you, was Jane Goodall. I loved her. I loved her work. She had, I got to see her speak with my mom, took me to see her speak, and I was just sold. And so I kind of went on this journey of like, um, always writing letters to the government about saving the whales. You know, I was very, as a child, very much, I think, rooted in this activist mindset. It was just something that really drove me, and that was kind of inherent, like inherently part of who I was, but not necessarily environmental for me. I don't think I knew anybody else actually at the time who didn't eat meat. I don't think I knew anybody else who was thinking along those lines. I remember in the 6th grade, we were asked to write something about what we wanted to do when we grew up. And I wrote a whole thing about how I wanted to be a zoologist. And I don't think anyone in the class, any of the other 11-year-olds in the class even knew what that meant. So it was just always part of who I am right from the start. And it was that I think, interestingly, I never thought about myself as being an activist until I was at Canisius. And I was actually at the airport waiting to go home. And one of my professors was there. We were all sitting at the bar together. And he asked me outright, he said, "Erin, do you consider yourself to be an activist?" And I was like, "Oh, no." And because in my head, I'm thinking picket lines, you know, signs like save the animals. And I mean, I would do that, absolutely, but I didn't do that, and I didn't really I was kind of shy about that idea of being an activist. But he said, "Well, do you advocate for better treatment of other animals?" And I was like, "Well, of course I do." And he said, "Well, then you're an activist." And it really resonated with me. And I really took that to heart, and I have called myself an activist ever since then. And I've taken some more, I don't know, I feel like I was nervous about being that person because when I was growing up and I was a child and I was, you know, not eating meat and I was a vegetarian at that time, um, people would always tease me and bully me about it. And so I kind of learned to just brush it off and not talk about it. Even though I had really strong personal views about it, I tried to, even right up into my 20s, I really didn't, I guess, think about ways that I could use my knowledge to help others see things in a different perspective. And at the same time, having grown up in that environment, I think has really helped me also to take a very, hopefully, take a very non judgmental approach to my work. So I never want to make anyone feel as though they're doing something immoral or wrong. And I want everyone to know that we you know, we're all somewhere on the spectrum. And even if you eat animals, you know, there's still this love for animals as well. And there's, you know, there's definitely this cognitive dissonance for sure. But you know, I don't see that as being an immoral act. I mean, I would personally, I wouldn't do it, but for someone else, I know that this is a process. This doesn't happen overnight, and me saying don't do X, Y, Z isn't going to change anyone's behavior. And so if I want to advocate for other animals, I have to be empathetic with people, and empathetic to where they are in their journey, and know that everybody is at a different point in their journey. And maybe they'll stay at that point in their journey, and I'm that's their decision to make.
Two things. When you said it really hit me when I met, my brain went, I wonder if she's going to say Jane Goodall when you said Jane. I've
I
seen
wish.
I've seen Jane Goodall speak as well,
Yeah.
so I hear you on that. And the other thing I was going to say was, I was sitting here going, I wonder if I can ask Erin if she calls herself an activist. And then I was thinking as you're talking, I was like, if I ask her that, I'm going to have to define what I mean by that so she can answer that correctly. So thank you for like answering all my questions. Well, not all, because I've got a million written down here, but some of my questions before I ask. I'm looking at the time. We don't have time for too many more, but I was just wondering, with your PhD, you said you talked about how our expectations about dogs and dog behavior influence their lives and their behavior. So, two questions on this. You've obviously come from Canada, and sorry about your dog that passed there. Obviously, dogs do that because they don't live as long as we want them to.
Yes.
But you've lived there, you've lived in that culture, and I
Mhm.
love Canada, by the way. And I would assume, and you tell me your opinion, that it's quite similar to New Zealand in lots of ways. And you lived in New Zealand, so I'm assuming that the expectations about dogs and dog behavior changes across cultures. So, like, how does that factor into um, your PhD and your thinking around that? And also, with regards to Western culture, and even across Western culture, I know it's going to be different, but like, how would you describe our expectations, our being the general populace, not
Mhm.
the listeners of this show,
Mhm.
although they are included, but I'm talking broader than that. How would you describe our expectations about dogs and dog behavior?
Okay, great question. So, yeah, I did not take a cross-cultural approach to this research. I was interested in companion dogs only, so that is one thing to clarify. So I wasn't looking at, say, free roaming dogs and their culture, or I wasn't looking at working dogs or um, dogs in animal assisted interventions or anything along those lines, simply companion dogs. And I was also, my participants were primarily lay people, so just regular dog caregivers, which is what I was aiming for because I wanted just the everyday average dog lover to chime in on what they think about those expectations, including what they think about training and what they're doing versus what what they think they're doing versus what they're actually doing. So there were definitely a few things that popped up in that. Well, first is the underlying thread of human exceptionalism is there in almost everything that we're doing with our dogs, or in a lot of things that we're doing with our dogs, and not in an implicit way. So we may say, "Oh no, I love my dog so much. He's part of the family. He's my fur baby." um, but they're still not in any way equal to humans. We still see dogs who are rehomed regularly, discarded, euthanized for behavioral issues. We see dogs wearing shock collars, which I'm sure you wouldn't put on your human child. So I can't imagine that they are considered on the same sort of level, so to speak, as humans in that regard. Um, but that's not to say that we don't love and people don't love their dogs because they absolutely do. And they care for them in many ways. They, care for their medical treatment and feed them the best foods and they buy them their fancy beds. And that's great. But I think it's those more implicit interactions that we're having with them, including the way that we're training dogs as well. So I think the expectation about having a dog that behaves in a particular way, especially when in public. So barking a little bit, not too much. They have to be friendly towards everybody. And they can't really have an opinion about things. They just have to sort of go along with it and comply. And having exceptional recall all of the time, even when there's distractions in the environment. Those were the main things I think that I came across, especially during my interviews, with what people really wanted. And I think most people had a good understanding about teaching their dogs new behaviors using positive reinforcement. But then when it came to undesired behaviors, excessive barking or not being friendly, a big one for people, I kind of went through and said, what do you think makes a good dog good, or what do you think makes a bad dog bad? Well, in that bad category, people always put aggression, no matter what it was. Aggression was a big one that was in there. And so anytime they talked about what they would do during misbehavior, they talked primarily about using things like positive punishment or negative reinforcement, or just not even those things, just trying to use those things, but not thinking about it that way. And that included everything from trying to scare them to putting things on their bodies that they didn't like because they knew it suppressed their behavior, to actually hitting them. I had a few participants actually say that they would, hit their dog under the jaw when he barked, and those kinds of things as well. But then when, they really thought they were only using positive reinforcement. So that, again, there's this cognitive disconnect there, this cognitive dissonance about what they think they're doing versus what they are actually doing. And it's all based on, I think society's idea of what a good dog should look like. And it's very, very like much in that good category, and that like they obey us and they will submit when we ask them to. So definitely that indicates to me that there is that assumption of human exceptionalism there, that's influencing how we're thinking about the dogs in our lives, even if we don't think we are.
I think I've got time for one more
Okay.
in this episode. And that question is around expectations, and you described what they are. And I think for the listeners of this show, there won't be any surprises there. I'm curious, in your perception, and I don't know if your research went into this, but even if it didn't, just curious to hear your opinion. Like, what's forming our current, and once again, the listeners of the show might know the answer and what you're going to say, or that you might say something completely different. But in your words, I really want to hear it. Like, what's setting the expectations, in 2024 that you came across in your research, or whenever at the time was that you did your research?
I think that, so part of what I discuss in my thesis is that the way that we socially construct dogs, so the way that we socially construct things like gender, roles, those kinds of things are similar to the way that we construct dogs and their behavior. So it's this society's expectations. It's not necessarily even our own individual expectations. It's this way that they're expected to behave in society. And then we have the rules and bylaws around having dogs. They're not allowed to just have private lives and roam freely around the neighborhood. They have to be attached to us at all times, literally and figuratively, when out in public. They have to be under control, and control is I think a big thread throughout my thesis as well, is that expectation of having full control over another being. And there's this fear that if they don't have control, that a dog is going to be taken away from them, or even potentially euthanized, or that it's the dog that's always going to pay that ultimate price for that, that misconduct of behavior. And so I think that the rules that are in place I'm not saying they're good or bad or either way, but I think they are influencing how we are expecting our dogs to behave. And yeah, I think like so there's this whole book by Clinton Sanders and his research about this exact topic, like what is influencing people to think, um, to have these different expectations about their dogs. And he talks about, a lot of it like is trying to, I guess the whole idea about responsibility, right? Like, are we responsible dog owners? And if we're not responsible, then it's embarrassing or we feel very guilty about doing the wrong thing. And I think that then people tend to use what he coins as excusing tactics when their dog misbehaves. Maybe they run up to an unfamiliar people and they say, "Oh, he's just like that. He's just young." Or they might even show that they're disciplining their dog so that they are demonstrating to the other person that they are in control, and not to worry that they have things under control. And they will, even though they didn't for a moment, they are regaining that control of their dog in that public space. And so I think all of those things really play into it.
And made me think just at the end there, as you're talking, control as a primary reinforcer, or maybe in this case, control, the illusion of control as a social reinforcer.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it makes me think that when we think about all of the clients that we help, and obviously there's a bell curve in terms of any metric that we're measuring about those clients, and there's a continuum of like where your client sits on in terms of how much knowledge they have, how much they are reinforced by these things that we've just talked about or not reinforced by them. But I've always thought about the lack sometimes of focus we have on the problem we're solving for these people is to remove the embarrassment. Like that's the actual, because and what you're just saying is really interesting to me, because I've always thinking about that. Like, we're selling our, we're going to build great relationships and we're going to do this, but the people are not wanting to be embarrassed.
Exactly.
That's
Truly.
powerful.
Yeah.
I think so too. But I haven't spoke to someone who's done research specifically that touches on this space. That's super interesting. Well, hey, Erin, thank you so much for sharing everything. I love hearing about people's behavioral odysseys. I could keep asking you questions because I've written a million down. Probably looked like I was working on a different computer doing something completely different whilst you were talking to me, but I wasn't. I was just nonstop writing the whole time. That does bring us to the end of part one, though. Before we officially wrap up, I know you've already mentioned it, but can you just tell everyone listening where they can go to find out more about you, what you do, get in touch if you want to share any of your social media contacts or links, please go ahead and do that as well.
Great. Yeah, absolutely. So most of my writing, or access at least to my books and to my articles that I've written, webinars, podcasts, all of that is on my website, which is meritdogproject.com. And so you can really access all of my information there or contact me through there. I'm not great with social media, but I am on Facebook. So that's Merit Dog, or Merit Dog Project on Facebook.
Fantastic. And we will, of course, link to all of this in the show notes as well. Hey, Erin, from myself and from everyone listening, this has been so much fun. So thank you so much again for coming out and hanging out with us.
Thank you so much for having me.
And thank you so much for listening as well. This is your host, Ryan Cartledge, signing off from this episode of the Animal Training Academy podcast show. We hope today's conversation inspired you and equipped you with new tools for your trainer's toolbox. Remember, every challenge in training is an opportunity to learn and sharpen your animal training geekery. Embrace the rough patches, learn from them, and keep improving. And don't forget, the path to growing your skills and expanding your knowledge continues beyond this episode. Visit www.animaltraining.com atamember.com to join our supportive membership, where you will find a community of trainers just like you. Together, we're making a huge positive difference in the lives of animal and human learners worldwide. Until next time, keep honing your skills, stay awesome, and remember, every interaction with an animal or human learner is your opportunity to create ripples. We're here cheering you on every step of the way. See you at the next episode.